Okay, so welcome everybody to How to Craft a Villain. I'm really looking forward to this one. This is a fun one. So my name is Susan Forrest. I'll be your moderator today. And what I'll do is I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, and I'll introduce the topic. And as we go along, I have a number of questions to stimulate conversation, although I think we'll have plenty of everybody just weighing in, and that's the best when it's free flow and doesn't really need a lot of questions feeding in. However, I do know that audience members love to have their questions brought up. So please, please, please put your questions that you would like us to address in the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen. And some of the panels I've been moderating, the people have been putting a lot of stuff into chat. And I've got three hats. I'm the host, the moderator, and a panelist. And I do find it a little tricky to check my notes and questions and the chat and the Q&A all at once. So if you can keep them in the Q&A, I'm much more likely to bring them up for the panelists. And then at 10:02, our panel will end because the channel's being used by somebody else. Right. Okay. So without further ado, Ron, you're on my left. Would you mind introducing yourself first?
Okay. My name is Friedman. I write primarily science fiction. Also on my day job, I'm an IT guy. And at work, they send me to all kinds of courses like leadership, high performance leadership and stuff, where you learn about conflict resolution. And when you learn about how to resolve conflicts, it's give you a lot of idea as a writer on how to create conflicts.
Yeah.
So that's the other way around. Yeah. So it's especially things about how the human brain, and that ties really, really nicely because a lot of movie stories, books that I write, the villain is not really well rounded. It doesn't have a depth. It's a lot of the time it's a flat villain that we don't understand its motivation, why he or she are doing what they are doing, and try to add some more depth to the villain is something that is absolutely essential to anyone who wants to become a writer.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Nina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Susan. I'm Nina Munteanu, as it says down there. Nina Munteanu. Munteanu, I like to tell people where that comes from. It's actually a Romanian name. I'm mispronouncing it. Apparently, I was told on a radio show by a fellow Romanian, which was a little embarrassing, but there you go. It's really supposed to be pronounced Munteanu, but see, I always have to do something with my hands when I say it like that. It's not Italian, it's Romanian. Munte means mountain, and anu means from. So there I am. I'm from the mountain. And Nina, of course. So I'm the little girl from the mountain. You can call me Heidi if you want. Remember Heidi? No, it's before your time, yeah, probably.
It's, Switzerland.
Is it before your time?
Oh, I'm old.
Yeah, okay. Okay, anyway, I teach writing at U of T. I teach a course on how to write science fiction at George Brown and elsewhere, and I coach writers. And I'm also a published novelist and short story writer, a number of works out there. And obviously all of them have conflict and all of them have an antagonist, villain per se. And as Ron said, one of the fun parts, it can be really fun, is to make your villain a true character, a fully fleshed character. I mean, there's nothing worse than a cardboard villain, bad guy with the mustache, and he's whatever he does, we don't understand him. So ways to make the villain per se, the antagonist, more realizable, more relatable even, richer character, only enriches every other part of the story, including the hero. And that's kind of what I want to talk about too with you folks, how all this meshes together and creates a great story.
Thank you. So my name is Susan Forrest. I written about 25 or 30 short stories that have been published internationally. Analog Asimov's Beneath Ceaseless Skies. My series, Addicted to Heaven, starts with Bursts of Fire, Flights of Marigold. The third one, Gathering of Ghosts, is coming out in 2023. I also edit for Laxa Media. We have some award-winning anthologies, and I freelance edit, and I teach, and obviously come to conventions too. And yeah, I'll weigh in some opening remarks. I would like to start off by asking our panelists a little bit. I like to start a bit with the definition, because I like to know what it is we're talking about. And I'm going to weigh in here because some of the research I've done has come up with different types of villains. So we have the supervillain, which has been mentioned. We have the ordinary antagonist. We have an organization or society that has forces of antagonism. And we've got the internal antagonist as well, right? Remember,
Definitely.
The three of us mostly come from science fiction fantasy background, but we have literary writers, romance writers, thriller writers. We have writers from all different backgrounds who are not necessarily working in the speculative genres. And so that internal antagonist can be a primary antagonist in certain genres. So yeah, so I threw out four. You may have some other ideas. You want to talk a little bit about what is an antagonist, what is a villain, what's the difference, or an opponent, as John Truby would use that term, and the different types.
Great question. Great question. Yeah, I in the course that I teach science fiction, but it's just fiction, really. I have a whole chapter devoted to that out of the book that I use, The Fiction Writer. And ultimately, you mentioned those different villains, right? Villains, antagonists. Really, antagonists is probably the best word to use, because we're talking about relationship, that relation between whatever we call that to the protagonist, the hero per se. So hero, villain, protagonist, antagonist. And whether they take on a metaphoric role, a literal role, in other words, they personify something, they encapsulate something, they're still representing something. So it's all metaphor. All fiction is metaphor, from the title to the world itself being metaphoric, to the characters being metaphoric, and what they do and what they say, etc. As Ray Bradbury said to me once, and I take that for a gospel. The thing is, you mentioned the internal, and it's not just in literary fiction, although in literary fiction it's more obvious that the antagonist could be an internal one. It's the ghost under the bed. It's linked to the internal conflict of the hero. So it doesn't have to be I'm trying to think of a word. It doesn't have to come forward as a being per se, as a character, but it can manifest through the main character. And essentially it's fear. If you think of all the antagonists, they represent something about the hero that they need to overcome. So whether it's an actual person like Darth Vader with Luke Skywalker, or whether it's, again, the ghost under the bed, the fear factor of the hero that needs to overcome. I'm thinking of the movie, is it called The Fountain? And it's all about what the hero needs to overcome in himself to move forward, either to forgive, either to discover and triumph over something that's a block. So anything that blocks the hero is potentially an antagonist.
Ron.
Yeah, and I can add maybe one more type of antagonist. That's the force of nature. So it could be a person. Like one example I can give is from Lord of the Ring. We have Sauron that we think So it's look like a somewhat a flat villain, but it is a very important character to the plot. And you can compare it to Saruman. Saruman is more in depth, so you understand better what are the motivation behind Saruman. If you remember the scene when Gandalf came to Saruman and tried to tell him, hey, the ring is there, the forces of Mordor are about to come here and we need to prepare. Saruman actually aligns himself with Sauron, with the force of nature. This is something that we don't understand why Sauron is doing what he is, but he has a huge army. He had the Nazgul, he have a spell powers, and he can do a lot of damage, and he is very powerful. And Saruman is actually trying to survive. So we told him that we cannot win against Mordor. There is no choice. The only thing we can do is join them and try to, it will be wise to join them. So we understand Saruman, we can identify with it. We don't agree with him. We think we need to fight evil, but we understand why he is doing what he is, because he's an antagonist. Take the role of the antagonist, and he fight Gandalf and imprison him, eventually Gandalf. But the difference is, again, we have the force of nature, that godlike power that come to destroy, and it's very powerful with huge armies that we don't really understand, and people who join him that we even they have some power, and we understand them because all they want to do is to survive, and based on how they see the world, how they understand the world, and how Saruman understand the world, is that there is no winning against Mordor, so there is no choice.
So yeah,
Ron, I'm so glad you brought. Sorry,
when I
go ahead.
talk about the super villain, that would include forces of nature, because the super villain is unknowable. They have no arc; they're flat arc. So the story about a person battling an avalanche or something like that fits super villain type of antagonist. And
Susan, I would disagree.
Supernatural monsters, like if you're writing about supernatural monsters, that would fit that category, but also conditions. So for instance, I just finished reading a wonderful book, The Time Traveler's Wife, and the force of antagonism, is a supervillain. It is time travel. It is the fact that her husband disappears, and he's naked and hungry and has no resources, and he has to learn to pickpocket or to break into places to get food and clothing until he suddenly reappears back in his regular life. So that force of antagonism is unknowable. Sorry, Nina, I cut you off.
Well, I was in the process of disagreeing with the term and how it's used, but now I'm coming around a little bit. I just find that the use,
right? It's a category of the monster or the condition or the supervillain, the one with the flat arc that is unknowable, that we probably never meet there.
And that's the part that I disagree with, and that's why if we define supervillain as flat, like the mustachioed, that figure. I don't agree that the force of nature, particularly, I'm so glad Ron brought that up, is a supervillain in that regard. It's almost like stereotyping it when it can represent so much more in terms of how the character relates to it. And I say it because, well, I say it because I can't say anything else. It's more than it. It's the character relating to themselves, because the force of nature always comes back to the character and their journey and how they relate to the world. It's one of the largest, most symbolic, wonderfully iterated and multi-layered ways of relating the hero on a journey, or the protagonist on a journey, if we don't want to use the word hero per se. Again, some of these terms become cliched a little bit, and we pigeonhole them. But if we use them in a wider sense, and that's why I jumped on supervillain, because
one category or two categories.
It uses the word villain, and it uses the word super. And if you take, for instance, I would I would use another word. I'm into semantics here, and we are, our society is moving, is evolving into a better place, more understanding, and I think that's one of the places where we can grow and use better terms. And that's just me. I'm just knocking that one. I would use something else. If you take, for instance, an example, if we take Solaris, the movie, the book by Stanislaw Lem, and the planet essentially is, in your definition, would be the supervillain, the planet, right? That interferes, that reads people's minds, picks out their largest angsts, their dreams, and realizes them and brings them back. It's like a reflection, like a mirror. It's far more than that. If you think of it as just a supervillain, as a bad thing that we need to either overcome or try and understand, it leaves out the journey of the protagonists themselves and how they relate to things and their environment. And I would almost want to call it something else, but that's just me.
Well,
you know what I'm
agree or disagree whether that's one category.
Yeah.
I think that typically we tend to automatically go into the ordinary villain, which I think is the most interesting category, but I didn't want the fact that there are forces of antagonism that are like the monster or the force of nature or time travel or something like that are not necessarily a human. But I think the ordinary villain or the ordinary antagonist is much more interesting. It's like so often the antagonist and the protagonist can be very similar.
Very similar. Right? And that's the thing. The ordinary villain is manifested.
They can, but they are, there's a moral point, right? And the ordinary hero, the everyday hero, is the one who tries and tries and tries, and they use the positive, and they may flirt with or experiment with the negative side of the moral question, but ultimately they're a hero because they will take the positive side. Whereas with the antagonist, they may have a lot of the same background, a lot of the same drives, a lot of the same needs and wants and goals, but they succumb and they and they use the negative side of the moral question.
Yeah. And that is very interesting because it's a study on psychology of what we value and how far we're able to go. And it sometimes tests our very nature in terms of the finer points of values, of virtues, in fact. You can have, for instance, loyalty tested against honor. Now, they're both virtues, but in different circumstances, one is going to be tested more. You're going to have to choose one over the other. And so with the villain or the antagonist who is manifested as a person, as a character, we can really play with that. What's important to these people, right? And how the protagonist differs from the antagonist. I'm trying to think of that example. X-Men, that's it. I think X-Men is a great example. What's his name? Professor X versus the metal guy.
Magneto.
Yeah, Magneto, that's it. And they're both very similar. They grew up in a similar environment and they were buddies, right? And that's often the case. They were friends initially because they had, in some ways, a similar worldview. This is when it gets really interesting, when the worldviews are the same. I mean, that makes for great couples, right? If you have the same worldview, you're looking in the same direction. But their way of dealing with obstacles differs based on their values, and that comes out very well in that movie series.
One thing that I learned when I did high performance leadership is the survival model. And I think it's an excellent tool to identify or to bring motivation to characters. So basically, no villain see himself as a villain. Yeah, I am a villain. I'm going to do bad
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
And the villain think he's doing a good thing,
Yeah.
or he has a goal, and he's willing to do some sacrifice or some evil doing in order to achieve a greater good in his vision, in his the way he see the world. So the survival model works like this. You have something, some kind of event, and we all, nobody here is 100% objective. We all have subjective entities. Each one of us have a different background, different gender, different culture, a different personality, different language. Language is also important. So we see the same event and we interpret it in a little bit different way. So the two characters, X-Men and Professor X, Professor X and Magneto, they see the same event. The event is a politician trying to pass laws against mutants. So Magneto, he came from the Holocaust. He saw what happened when people are persecuting one ethnicity and go all the way. So he see the world, he see the same event as Professor X, but interpret it in a slightly different way,
Yes.
based on his personality and background and culture and language, and etc., etc. And then he take acts in order to survive. And also Professor X take act in order to survive. And it's not necessarily survival of his physical self, but maybe the survival of people who are close to him, his kings, his tribesmen, his people. Maybe some people willing to the soul honor. So you want something to survive, something that is related to you, and you take action in order to ensure the survival based on how you see the world. So Magneto decided to fight those politicians and fight the normal people who are not mutant, while Professor X believed that by showing how we protect the normal people, they will change their mind and help mutants. So both of them have a similar goal, different view of the world. So they take different action, and no one see himself or herself as a villain. They just have a very good goal, and they take action, different route of action, because they understand the world differently.
Well, exactly, like in a romance, for instance, Mr. Right and Mr. Wrong both have the same goal, just to get the girl, right?
What I was going to say about Ron's example, I felt for Magneto. And this is the thing, if you start to care for the villain, the antagonist, I don't like the word villain actually, if you start to care in some way because you understand why. And I think this is the key difference between a flat character and character that's more fully fleshed that you can then understand.
About that. Have you guys seen a movie called Into the Spider-Verse?
No.
I think I
Oh,
see
my
it's a cartoon, or is it a cartoon?
It's animated.
Animated. Yeah, I think
it
I saw
has
it.
the most amazing antagonist. His name is Kingpin. You can look this up on YouTube. I just did it the other day, and I measured it. It is 28 seconds of Kingpin's backstory. So Kingpin is talk about the flat character. We thought of somebody here who said, some people might make the argument that villains in children's stories, sorry, this is from Nick Begon, I should credit it, TV books, whatnot, are not going to be that fleshed out. And I counter with the examples of Azula from Avatar, The Last Airbender, and Xanatos from Gargoyles, and myriad of villains from Disney films, Frollo, Scar, Maleficent. But if you have a look at Kingpin's backstory, he's drawn as a black parabola with a face, okay? A white face in the middle. I mean, he is the epitome of the twirly back, totally flat. And there's 28 seconds. It shows him click a pen. It goes into his backstory. And then he clicks a pen and he's back into the main scene. And you get everything that you need to understand him as a fully fleshed out character in 28 seconds.
Yeah, doesn't take much.
Look it up on YouTube.
A key scene. The point being, though, that by understanding the villain, and again, those examples that Nick gave, and I agree with Nick. There's no reason why you need a flat villain, because it just you're losing the opportunity in a story, particularly a children's story, to provide the reasons for things, because there's reasons why antagonists are the way they are, behave the way they are. Bullies, for instance. Why is a bully a bully? Well, it's good to know why, because to know why, number one is to be armed. Number two is to feel compassion for the bully, which is an important aspect of living in society. And to understand that they themselves are victims, because that's really what most bullies are. They're victims, and they're lashing out in anger, and they're, this whole power thing going on. But if you understand, that frees you to some extent. And anyway, so for kids' books, I think it's almost key that the villain is not just some ridiculous force that you don't understand, because then
Nick's point is
missing
so many examples where they're not, they really are.
For sure. There are.
Yeah. Now, the third category, we've got somebody here, Audrey Jameson, I think it is. Yes. Do you have advice for writing person versus society stories where the antagonist role is filled by both an individual villain and the greater societal opponent? And I think that, because we're talking about different types of villains, we've got, the force of nature, whatever we want to call that one. We've got the ordinary villain, but the society. And I know as a teacher,
1984,
I teach
Handmaid's Tale.
and it's amazing how many times I'll be working with students and I'll say, okay, talk to me about your antagonist, because it is so important, especially in commercial fiction, right? But in any type of fiction, you need to know where those sources of obstacles for your protagonist are coming from. And so often, particularly writers who are just starting out, don't really have a really clear idea. And I want to go more into that later around developing your villain and writing techniques. But they'll say, well, society, that's the villain, that's the force of antagonism, which is great. And it's true. There are definitely societal forces of antagonism that work really well, but unless they are coalesced into an individual that you can identify with, the story lacks structure and it's weak. Although I will give one exception to that, and that is I read an amazing mystery. It did have an antagonist in the end, but I'll tell you, 50% of the way through the book, the actual antagonist never actually shows up. There's a detective who is trying to find a missing child, and he keeps going to various agencies. And each one he comes to, the person in charge is very sympathetic, and they say, we're trying to help street people. We're trying to help people with mental illness. I'm a doctor in the emergency department, and every single one of them can't do what they need to do because of budget cuts, because of lack of staffing, because of the overwhelming size of the problem. So each one of those was centered in an individual person, although it wasn't the main antagonist for the book. But that was a great way of having society as the forces of antagonism, but realized through individual characters.
Yeah. And readers kind of want that. They want to be able to see the manifestation of the societal problem in a figure that's relatable. And it all comes back to relating, right? So again, in 1984, the example I gave, Winston Smith, it's him against this society that's structured, but it's represented by a number of figures, and not just Big Brother, the symbol, but I forget the name of the main dude that turns out, I think it's Ford or something like that. No, that's the wrong book. That's Brave New World, similar. But the point is, that in that book and many others that are societal, I mean, a lot of science fiction is societal commentary on how something is structured. And you can have it layered. So you can have man versus society, but you need to have, as you mentioned before, you need to have microstructure, almost like a fractal relationship between man and society and what that represents. So various representatives of that society should be in the book and populate it for the main character to interact with, because it's ultimately about the character and what they value and how that differs from this society that's created, right? So often they're an other, like Winston Smith was an other, right? He was othered. He thought differently. He had different thoughts. And how does that play out in the society? Of course, we know how it plays out.
Yeah, I'll take maybe the biological aspect of it. Most animals cannot cooperate in large number. Even intelligence and social animals like wolf or the apes or dolphin, they need to know all the members. So the pack or the group are relatively small. What's special about us, about human, about Homo sapiens, is that we are able to tell stories. And when we can tell stories and millions of people believe in the same story, then we can function and collaborate in very, very large number. So this is where society comes along. We have a story, let's say Nazi Germany. The story is that the Aryan race is superior to the other, therefore we should have the ability to take from others. Or the communism, also that we want to make society better, so we need a very centralized government and do any step we can do any totalitarian step that's more similar to 1984. In order to have a better society, an ideal society. And if a lot of people believe in this story, and then the society has a lot of power, and sometimes they take this story too far and take very harsh step in order to reach their ideal world or utopian world or afterlife or whatever the story is. So they start to fight or abuse or resist anyone who think a little bit differently.
Yeah,
I think 1984 it was the individual versus society that believe in a certain story that was very centralized, very autocratic.
That's a really good example. The power of the narrative. In fact, in 1984, there is the manifesto, right? That it's embedded in the story that Winston ends up reading, and that this is where the rebels
rewrite history to make
exactly.
The story
so the
more
narrative,
accurate.
The narrative that drives that society is very well spelled out, or spent a lot of time writing, embedding that very manifesto in its form as a manifesto. You just basically go in and you read page upon page upon page of this manifesto within. So it's framed it's framing the story, and it works really, really well. And again, it's the narrative that we feed ourselves. Very good point, Ron.
That's only
and one of the panelists, Roma, mentions the Hunger Games, where society is represented by snow. Now, I have read Hunger Games, but I don't remember it as much as I remember the movie. And same thing with Divergent. I didn't read it. I only saw the movie. And I would say, and let's see what the panelists have to say about this, that yes, we have Snow representing society. He represents the forces of antagonism, but I would also call him kind of the twirly mustache kind of a villain. I don't see a lot of dimension in him. Same thing with the antagonist in Divergent. What do you think?
I think it's based on reality TV. So I know that there are producers and a lot of people are watching reality TV. So this is just, I think a lot of it, at least the first one, is the reality TV taken a step forward. One step forward. Let's do point. Ultimate reality TV, and the idea is to engage the audience so they will understand the story, and that way there will be more compliance. And I think reality TV is like, it was a very oppressing regime, but in the story they try to give them hope, or either the hope or diversion in the form of the games.
Susan, I agree. I think the villains are not fully fleshed. They're almost like more like a plot device to look more carefully at the relationships and how these people do their things. And Ron, that's perfect. That's what it is. It's fantastical reality TV, Really, it's
And just
they're
following
both
up on that,
contests, right?
I think one of the best forces of antagonism in the movie, at least, of Hunger Games, and I think it might have been the second or third one, can't remember, is they're at a party and somebody is passing around these drinks and they say, here, purge yourself, go throw up, and then you can eat more. And I'm thinking, that's interesting.
Oh, I don't remember that scene. I probably for a reason, because that
Yeah.
was gross. But within that construct, it's very fetchy. People love that. I mean, I just recently rewatched the Divergent series up to, Divergent, Insurgent, Allegiant. And I think what makes it fun is that there is antagonism, there is conflict in many levels. So there's within the contest itself of some kind, they're pitting themselves against something, right? They're trying to triumph over something, and that's often really neat to watch, right? How people progress. I think that's why reality TV is so popular. Not that I watch it. I kind of dislike the garbage that comes with it, but pitting oneself against the elements, etc., and within and the competition and how different people deal with the competitive idea. Some were helping others, even though they weren't supposed to. They're each man for himself. That sort of thing is interesting to watch, and it qualifies and it characterizes the main character, and that makes good story. So in that case,
bread and circuses.
Sorry, just let me finish. So the antagonist, the villain, the main villain, isn't the important antagonist here. The main antagonist is closer to within each other. The contestants, what goes on between the contestants. It's more about the character themselves, how they overcome things, etc., that kind of stuff. That villain is like a supervillain. It's like Voldemort in Harry Potter. What was the most interesting thing about the Harry Potter series? What was going on among the kids, right? What Harry had to do with all the others, how he fit in and how he didn't fit in, and all the other so-called villains, what's his name? I forget his name. Anyway, there's a bunch of them, right? The Slytherin, and that follows the same pattern as these other two movies or books, Slytherin versus Gryffindor, right? So there's a competition always going on. And if you think about it, when I was watching the movies or even reading the books, those were some of the most fun parts, is the most entertaining to read, were the parts where the kids were interacting with each other and you were discovering a lot more about the characters. It was really about the characters and how they developed. Mm-hmm. And I guess a lot of all three of those are coming of age as well. So the focus is more on self-discovery, on growing up, on maturing, and learning about self, learning about the world, through various other antagonists, right? Through all the conflicts that they go through. So the main antagonist is almost like that big god that's, sitting up there, the big threat, I should say, like climate change or something like that. It's the big threat, the unknowable threat, as you mentioned, supervillain, that just sits there and sets up the atmosphere of the place. And then the real conflict, the main conflict, the entertaining conflict, is what occurs within that. And then eventually, we get up there.
And actually, that's a great segue into the fourth type of antagonist, right? Which is the internal antagonist. And one of the things that I think that any really fully fleshed out story, and again, there are different types of stories. If you're writing James Bond, and who would not want to be the author because multimillionaire, right? Or if you're writing Miss Marple or something like that, you don't need to go into all of these layers of internal conflict. And in fact, if you did, you'd ruin the story. But for a lot of the books that we're talking about and that we love to read, there's the external conflict, there's it could be the supervillain, could be the ordinary villain, but there's also that internal antagonist. I think, Nina, you were talking about fear. I think shame also would fit into that category, or that ghost that haunts the central character. And some stories foreground the external, but they are enriched if there's an internal conflict as well. And other stories foreground the internal conflict as primary, but there should be a metaphorical external conflict that gives resonance to that internal story.
Yeah, they should reflect each other. When they do, they very much like a synergistic interaction between two organisms. They play on each other, right? And one creates the other like waves. So it's by not doing that, the writer is missing a huge opportunity to add depth to the story. And when you have more depth, metaphoric depth, which Susan, you pointed out, metaphor is the big one here. The story itself is flat. And that's the huge difference, is making those linkages. Place, for instance, I know I'm going off here because it's the antagonist, but place can be an antagonist as well, or not. And it's all comes back to the character and what they need to be doing, their journey, whatever it is they need to be doing, if it's simply to grow up and become more mature, to triumph over something, over fear, over shame, whatever, being different, etc., and embracing that difference instead of trying to compensate for it or hide it. All relates back to all the things everything that they interact with, including the obvious antagonist and the not so obvious antagonist. And I think the less obvious antagonist is the most interesting, to be honest, because that's the one that gets you in the back of the head.
I'd like to follow up on that, but I haven't heard from Ron for a couple of minutes. So maybe Ron, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I would like, we are all writers, or a lot of people on the audience are writers. So I like to give you here a method that I saw in a lot of storytelling, and I'm using it myself. And that's going back to high school and philosophy class, when you learn about John Immanuel Kant, who his philosophy is a Kantianism versus utilitarianism. That's Stuart Mill. No, sorry, Immanuel Kant versus John Stuart Mill. So Kantianism say whatever action, you should have values, and you should always follow this value. Like if somebody say you shall not lie, never lie, just keep doing because this is the good thing to do all the time. Utilitarianism, he said the value are less important. The real important thing is what are the end results. So let's say if there are, there's a story like a cannibal captured 10 tourists, and they give a gun to one of the tourists, and they tell him, you have to kill one of the other tourists, and then we are going to release the rest. And if you don't do that, we're going to kill everyone. It's like the trolley problem. So somebody who follow the John Immanuel Kant Kantianism, you will say, no, you shall not kill. I'm not killing because this is an awful thing. We don't want to kill under any circumstances. But somebody will say, who believe in utilitarianism, will say, okay, if I kill one person, I save 9 instead of all 10 of us die. So it does make sense to kill. And once you have these conflicting philosophies in a person, and then the persons need to weight those two philosophies and go to a decision. This is a very internal topic that I saw it being used a lot. The 100 series, like almost every episode was based on the utilitarianism. Yeah, we don't have enough air in the space station. We need to kill a few in order to save the later. So the agent one from the first Doctor Strange, should I draw on from the dark power? This is a really bad thing, or use the time stone, which is a really bad thing, but we are going to save the Earth from whoever is invading it. I don't remember that character, this monster. So there is a utility, and Mordor say, no, you cannot do this. This is bad. The bill come due always. never do the bad thing. Stick to your values, be good. And Doctor Strange and the Agent One, I think he was a cleric, Celtic cleric or something, a druid or something. No, we can sometimes use the dark side in order to get a different. So that if you have this internal conflict based on philosophy, we can learn a lot about the characters. And this
Definitely.
is a trick that authors can use.
So yeah, I'd like to just follow up on what Nina said a little bit earlier about the different types of villains that can, or antagonists, that can show up in the same story. And sometimes it's not the big overarching one that's the most interesting. If you look at John Truby's book, Anatomy of Story, he doesn't like the word villain or antagonist. He uses opponent, but he talks about different types, and he talks about your primary opponent, but he also talks about the ally, the fake ally opponent, and the fake opponent ally. And
Yeah,
one of the
shapeshifters.
ones that I think is the best example of that is in the movie Thelma and Louise. There's a character of the policeman who is trying to interview Thelma and Louise to find out about the man who got shot near the beginning of the film. And the only reason he's trying to track them down is to interview them, not because they're suspects and not for any other reason. He seems like an opponent right from the get-go because he's chasing them the entire time. And in the end, spoiler, it's an old film, I'm sure everybody's seen it. There's a row of police cars, there's a row of policemen all pointing their guns at Thelma and Louise. And this policeman runs out and he says, "Stop, don't shoot, don't shoot." He is actually an ally the entire time, even though he looks like an opponent the entire time.
Yeah, that's the shapeshifter, the archetype, the shapeshifter archetype. And that's very, very interesting type of character.
The betrayal of the best friend sort of thing.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Ally opponent.
Yeah, in the comments there is the comment about the Professor Snap from Harry Potter series.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
So
So again, they
and I
trick
get everybody to give one minute final word before we wrap up.
Well, my sort of last take is ask the question why for all your characters, and think of doing something a little different, and connect your antagonists or your opponents or whatever you want to call them to the journey of your protagonist. And everything has meaning. Everything is connected. The more it is, the more depth you're going to get. And the reader is going to see so much more in that story and experience so much more.
My take is get into the villain's head. Nobody see himself or herself as a villain. And a villain has a motivation and has a reason to why he's doing what he's doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the villain is important. That would be my final thing, is lots of times, especially with people who are just starting out in their writing journey, I see really spend a lot of time focusing on the protagonist. But there's a famous saying, Act 2 belongs to the villain. If you have a problem in your writing and you can't get the story to work, dollars to donuts, you don't know your antagonist well enough. They're powerful, they have a plan, they carry out their plan, they're trying to do something. So
yeah,
my last one. And here we are at 11:49. The channel is going to be used in 30 seconds by somebody else. I just want to say thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to WWC and the Imaginative Fiction Writers Association for putting together this panel opportunity for us. And thank you to everybody who attended. Have a great rest of your conference.
Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.